It is my distinct honor to introduce to all of you the Bishop Dwayne David Royster, who comes to us currently holding the position of the National Political Director for Faith in Action, formerly the PICO National Network, which is a national community organizing project that engages communities of faith and individuals of faith in organizing on behalf of the welfare and benefit of the communities of the people from which they come. He's also the designated pastor of Faith United Church of Christ in Washington, D.C., as well as the senior pastor and founder emeritus of the Living Water United Church of Christ in Philadelphia as well. He has extensive organizing, advocacy, political, and faith leadership experience. He's also the former director of Power, Philadelphians Organized to Witness, Empower, and Rebuild, a former councilman at large for the municipality of Norristown, Pennsylvania. And Bishop Royster also serves as the founder of the Society for Faith and Justice. The society is an ecumenical religious order committed to a charism of social justice as spiritual discipline and as spiritual practice. And he holds his Episcopal credentials with the Higher Ground Christian Fellowship International. And we met, as I suggested, more than 30 years ago. In fact, when I met Bishop Royster, he was an 18-year-old gentleman who was joining my fraternity. And we have grown through the years, and we have grown in common commitment to this work ahead of us. So Bishop, welcome. And I think what we're going to do is I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and he and I will dialogue a bit, and then we'll open up some time for you to join us. So Bishop, good afternoon. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Dr. Ray. Thank you for having me on the program today. I really appreciate it.
So the first question that we had talked about that I'd like you to begin reflecting on is, what does it mean to talk about people of faith, people of goodwill, and the whole question of civic responsibility?
Yeah, you know, this is a very interesting period in human history. And when we think about the work of civic responsibility, or as you've often referred to it as civic courage, one of the things that I think we have to address is that in this particular moment, moderation is not faithful. That being in the middle is not necessarily a faithful position. In a moment and age where we are dealing with deep bias against gender, against race, against those of different gender identities, we are finding ourselves in a moment when the church and people of faith must speak and be prophetic. I think the church often goes through ages when there are times and places when we can settle in and do certain ministries. And this particular moment is the age of being a prophetic church, which then requires a different level of engagement from us as clergy and from congregations as well. I think it's an imperative that we understand in a prophetic moment that we have to get out in the public square, and that part of our call is to be public theologians, to speak truth to power, but also speak truth to the people simultaneously, and not be afraid of that. One of the challenges I've seen over the last few years are oftentimes the fact that there are colleagues who are leading congregations that are both, for lack of a better term, red and blue, who feel like they cannot speak truth for fear of losing their jobs. And I think we have to really begin to ask ourselves the question, what does it mean to be courageous, both civically and congregationally in this moment, to be able to move our communities, our towns, our cities, our states, our nation towards becoming and building beloved community? And then what does it also mean that I've said this over and over again to people throughout the years, just because you preach a prophetic sermon doesn't mean that you've done much. That it's not just about preaching on Sunday morning or teaching a Bible study. It is literally showing up in the town square speaking to and sometimes speaking at political and business leaders and others that are responsible for the oppression of people, and letting them know without any ambiguity what it is that God has called us to as people of faith. Many of these folk are claim to be people of faith, speaking that truth and calling for society to its better self. So when I think about civic engagement, when I think about courage, it's not just about getting people out to vote. That is just a piece of the process. But what does it mean for us to engage in civil society? And let me just say this, add this one other piece to that too. I know that as Americans, we've often said, oh, there's a separation of church and state, there's a separation between faith and government. Yet, if we go back to our sacred text, there was no separation between the two. That they were often one and the same. And for us to think that somehow or another our faith, as we understand it, is not supposed to have some influence in terms of how we lead and how we run our government, I think becomes very problematic. So it doesn't mean that we set up a theocracy, but what it does mean is that our faith has something to say about the moral direction and the moral direction of our government and the moral responsibility of those in leadership to carry out those responsibilities. And if we don't speak up and say something about it, who will? I think that's part of the engagement and struggle that we're having both with millennials and Gen Z right now, is that they have seen a church that, for a lack of a better term, has been pretty lackadaisical in terms of civic engagement and concerning itself only with the salvation of the soul without seeing to the salvation of community, the salvation of the planet, the salvation of the world as we understand it.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Let me press you a little bit and ask you about another idea that certainly we've spoken about through the years.
Mhm.
Is what do you think it means in this particular moment? Because, of course, we know when we talk about people of good faith showing up, we don't make it as a general statement, right? We talk about it where you are historically, physically, et cetera.
That's right.
What do you think it means today for people of faith across the spectrum of faith? You know, folk who have confessional faith that's rooted either in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, all the way to people who simply have a kind of civic faith that they believe in the promise of this nation. What does it mean for people of faith to materialize good in this particular historical moment?
Yeah, that's a really powerful question, and um, let me put it in some practical terms. So, contrary to my last statement, I tend to be a bit of a storyteller. So tell stories, and I tell stories in a way that helps to convey this moment. When I think that there is a good that we often want to do that is rooted in direct service. So, the congregation I serve in DC, Faith United Church of Christ, especially during the COVID crisis, we fed about 400 folk a month from our food program that we do and our benevolence ministry and things that we are continuing to do. And that's good. But I think that here's the issue. How are we going upstream and asking the question, why are there 400 families that need food? And how are we really looking at addressing the good that changes systems and structures? I think a lot of times we think we are doing good by providing direct service, but the problem is that direct service imagines that the status quo is right in the first place. And I think for us, for many of us in this moment, we are asking the question. Well, we don't think the status quo is good. We think the status quo is actually detrimental to human beings and to the world and to creation itself. But we are also trying to figure out how are we rooting out evil in the systems and structures that exist, and then creating policies and laws and changing players so that we can create community that is good. And I think we have to ask ourselves this question, and perhaps this is what you're getting to. What you're asking the question, what is good? And I think we have to go back to our traditions and our text to help us understand, at least from my theological perspective, and that, for me, many humanity is created in the image and likeness of God. And so then the work is, how are we working toward the common weal or the common good for all humanity so that every person is able to live their full best life and able to thrive? And how is the church working towards that end? So that regardless of their immigrant status, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of economic status, regardless of number of children they have, whether they're married, not married, whatever, how are we working it out so that we are working toward the good of every human being that lives in our country and in this world? And that, I think, is where God wants us to be, and the good that we are trying to work through in this moment and hour. It is, so it's incumbent upon us to act in a way towards that good. So let me just talk about some of the work I did with Power in Philadelphia. We discovered that at the Philadelphia airport, workers there were actually making less than the minimum wage because they were in tip positions, but they were not allowed to ask for tips. And that oftentimes some of the employers were actually having them report that they had tips so that they could show that they were paying them the minimum wage, and the employer would not have to put extra money towards paying them. So basically, some folk were making $2-3 an hour at a job where they should have been making at least $7.25 an hour. Now, mind you, you cannot live in Philadelphia area off of $7.25 an hour. Our faith community, and so Power at the time was about 40 congregations: Christian, Jewish, Muslim, ethical humanist, Unitarian Universalist, Quaker, all different kinds of communities coming together. We began a campaign at the Philadelphia airport and also with the city of Philadelphia itself, basically saying, you have people working in poverty wages in the city that they can't work in. And Pennsylvania, Philadelphia at the time had a law that said that everybody that worked at a city of Philadelphia owned project or worked for the city had to get paid 150% of the minimum wage plus benefits. Well, these workers were not getting that. So we launched this campaign. In the end, 25,000 workers from across the Philadelphia region doubled their salaries as a result of the work and began to get benefits, right? We began to see the material condition. But here's the interesting thing that happened as a result of this. We actually were able to track about $25 million a year that was going into some of the poorest communities in Philadelphia, that was actually supporting parents, that were helping to take care of children, that was helping to put food on the table, that was actually helping to transform some of the economic conditions and the material conditions of the people that were there. We see that as the common good. It wasn't just us going out and handing out food or doing things, which we should do, especially for those that struggle the deepest, but it was also working in partnership with those who were suffering, in particular those workers, helping them find their voice, to become empowered, to create the change that they wanted to see and change their material condition. And I think that is part of the good that we have to do at this moment. It's not always us doing it on behalf of people. It's often us doing it in partnership with people and helping people realize their own power and having a collective say in their own destiny.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me press that point a little bit, because I think in this political moment, there are many who despair that there actually is the possibility for us as a nation to realize the kind of civic goodness that you're talking about, because the bonds of the past are so strong. You know, there are many people who, you know, I'll admit to this, is that while, you know, I am not an Arminian by any stretch of the imagination, I am a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist, and yes, proud to say so. Even I was caught by surprise by the ferocity of the support for Donald Trump in his project to rebuild America in the image of the Jim Crow South. But I mean, even I was taken by surprise by the number of people who threw themselves fully into that project. And that raised a question for me, which I've raised on Facebook a couple of times, but I'd like you to talk a bit about. First, is it possible to build a new Civic Square with people who have as their first commitment that you accept a place in it as a second-class citizen? Is that even possible? And the second question, does it call on us as people of faith to even seek a new public square that requires that some take a subsidiary status, or is there another call upon us? Now, I'm going to qualify that and say that, I lift up prayers every day. First of all, giving thanks to God, but then also on behalf of my sisters and brothers who are workers in the vineyard, is we don't have arguments in my family about whether or not to support Donald Trump and his project of white nationalism. I'm not going to get off of talking terms with one of my cousins, brothers, uncles. So, I pray for people who find themselves in that situation, and I hope that some of our conversations will strengthen guidance. But I also recognize the challenge of imagining a new society that may be beyond the bonds of filial connection and the bonds of brotherly love. I mean, a couple of times in the book of Exodus, folk just had to move on and sort of to the future that God was calling them, and just leave Dathan and his crowd to whatever it was that the future held for them, because whatever it wasn't going to be their future. Jesus talked about when someone said, well, you don't have to go back and bury my father. You don't have to go back and check on my family. And, Jesus said in one of the hard sayings that sometimes you have to choose me, the work, over filial connection. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that in terms of imagining how people of goodwill, what they ought to dedicate themselves to if a society in which folk refuse to build a common future with them, how do we need to think about that?
Yeah, you were really kind, because that text actually says, let the dead bury the dead, right? And I think part of what we are experiencing right now is the last vestiges of white supremacy and white nationalism manifesting itself, because in the next few years, this country will not be majority white anymore. And folk are screaming and kicking, trying to figure out how to maintain power and how to keep control. This is going to be really hard, but sometimes you got to wipe the dust off your feet and keep stepping. One of the principles and things that I've been talking about over the last several years, and you and I have had conversations about this, has been asking this question: how do we become architects of a new America? And then, in many ways, not only are we talking about building a new nation, but we're also talking about how are we building a new civil religion. The construct of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, if we really were to go back and take a look at them, some of the rhetoric is really good, but if you go back and study the Constitution, it was designed for white male landowners. And when we really think about who benefits in this country right now, it's white male landowners. We've put some other language on top of it to make it seem like we really want equality. I crack up when I think about the fact that the president keeps saying he's the best president since Abraham Lincoln. And, if you really go back and look at Lincoln, he used slavery as a vehicle to try to to win the war, to get the country back on its get the country back together. But he did not believe in equality for black folk. I think we need to be very clear about that. That was not something he believed in. And so we, in many ways, have to literally take apart what's already here and build something brand new. And let me just be clear about this, right? We actually have traditions. If we go back in Jeremiah chapter 1, the call story of Jeremiah, in verse 10, God told Jeremiah to go and pluck up, pull down, destroy, overthrow, and then build in the plant. And that there are times and places when you cannot build what you need until you first clean the field and straighten out what you already have. And so we have to figure out ways that we can deconstruct the oligarchy and the unfettered capitalism that exists in our society, and begin to put in place new structures and new ways of being in community and governance together, so that we can find a way to build a multiracial governance structure for a country that is going to be probably one of the most diverse countries in all of the world in terms of race. And I think we got a lot of work to do with that. Audre Lorde said you can't use the master's tools to tear down the master's house. And I think that that's part of the struggle that we are constantly using right now, is that we're trying to use the master's tool to tear down the master's house. That's not going to work. And so we need to go back and even in some ways in our own faith, deconstruct and decolonize some of the ways that we have been formed and shaped, and really go back to a time prior to colonization of both our theological thought and our practice of our theology, to find the tools that are necessary to be able to recreate the world and society as it is. If I were to be frank with you, I don't think we will not be able to gently shift America. It will be a very abrupt and deeply structured and strategic shift to be able to move us to the place where the world can be in a better, move in a better way.
Okay. So that leads to, the second big question we had agreed we talk about, is in that work of creating a new America, being an architect of a new America. I mean, there's imaginative work, because I think that one of the biggest problems, and this is something that I literally do not have an answer for, but I think one of our biggest problems is that most of the people walking the streets of the United States, and most of the people on this call, have grown up in a way in which residential segregation has been so much a force in American life that most Americans literally cannot imagine what a multiracial society looks like. They can't imagine what it means for children who are white to believe that it's abnormal to live, go to school, and play in places where there are no people of color. Children of color grow up in such strictly segregated areas that if a white child shows up, it's an oddity and a curiosity, right? So in that circumstance in which you have this imaginative problem, right? Folk can't even imagine what a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy looks like. And the other side of that is the material reality that the effects of residential segregation means that most people find themselves in racially and ethnically homogenous places.
Yeah.
So they can't figure out what does it mean to do good on behalf of a multiracial democracy if the only people around me look like me. Right? What is the responsibility, do you think? Well, first, let me ask you to think about that, then I'll press the other question. But just to think about that reality.
Yeah, it's actually interesting with my work with Faith in Action. So in addition to being the national political director, I'm also the Northeast regional director. So I work with about 17 of our local and state organizations in the Northeast region. And when I push up into New England, and I heard earlier, I think it's Reverend Larimore is on here, that folk up in Vermont, and we have organizations up in Vermont and New Hampshire and those areas. And we have very few congregations of color. And if most of the clergy of color that engage in the work with us are generally leading white congregations. And if I were to be honest, most of them don't last very long at those congregations because there is a cultural difference between how Black clergy show up in those spaces and how white congregations operate with clergy. And we don't often know how to cross those bridges to one another in a very helpful and a very faithful way. I think, we got a problem. We have a deep problem with imagination. And if I could be real honest in this moment, and the church is part of the problem. Uh, if I were to be really honest, a lot of the anthropomorphic vision that we have of faith is rooted in an old white man that is the highest idea of what manhood and what godliness looks like. And so there in a deep down way, even to the essence of our DNA, we have this identity problem because we think therefore that what is white is right. And so then when we begin to even think about a multiracial democracy that might not be led by white folk, right? That might be led by folk of color because there are more folk of color. We don't know how to operate in that because we have not invested in the kinds of relationships that help to introduce us to the nuance of culture and society and traditions that are outside of our own normative framework. And it goes vice versa for Latinx folks and white folks, black folk and white folks, black folk and Latinx folks in other communities. We have not taken the time to really understand each other at a deeper level in terms of the ways that our communities operate and the ways that we think and what is important and what are priorities to us. Although at the end of the day, the priorities for like basic human living are pretty the same, but how those things manifest themselves become very different. So the intentionality, and you talk about civic courage, going back to civic courage again, is how do we intentionally build relationships across these lines, and especially for white folk in this particular space, how do you not feel compelled to have to dominate the conversation and relationship and think that everything in the way the world that you've grown up in is the right way to do it, and that become a student as opposed to necessarily becoming a teacher? How can white folk become students of culture and of society of those that are others in a way that's neither patronizing or patriarchal, but instead working on building deep relationship? The organizing work that we do and faith in action is deeply rooted in relationship, and it's also rooted in self-interest, and it's also rooted in story. So how do we learn each other's stories? How do we discover each other's self-interest and also discover each other's shared self-interest in spaces? And then how do we execute operating together to be able to create that good? And can we finally get to a place where we can acknowledge that maybe whiteness is not always rightness in terms of how we operate in a greater society?
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you for that. And, you know, one of the things that you reminded me of in that was, you know, as I've spoken about with you before, my vision for CTS
Hmm.
is that we become a school that creates and shapes interreligious leadership, where people come into an understanding of their own identity as religious leaders, as having people of other faith constitutive of it, so that they can't imagine a world in which there are only Christians, right? They
Right.
can't imagine, because that then becomes the way that people of color have always lived, right? I mean, none of us
Right.
have ever had the luxury of imagining a world without white people, but because of the ways in which residential segregation has shaped our world, there are millions of white people who can very easily imagine a world without us.
I mean, well, let me just piggyback on that for a minute. I mean, I just want to think about how this manifests itself in public policy and public practice. So I live right outside of Washington D.C. right now for the work that I'm doing, Faith in Action. I'm from Philly originally, my congregation is in D.C. So D.C., for those that don't know, during the 70s and 80s was about 75% African American. It has begun to change. It's gentrifying in some ways. The manifestation of how that gentrification works out, there's a particular community in Southeast Washington, D.C. that has been always the Black bastion, where white folk are beginning to move into that community. There's a type of music in DC called go-go music. And there's one store that for the last 30 years has been playing go-go music outside the store for 30 years. A new development came up around the corner from the store. Uh, and this new development was extremely expensive apartment properties. The new neighbors, who happen to all be white, complained that the go-go music was being played in the store and actually filed a complaint with the city. The city came to the store owners and basically said, you have to turn the music down. Well, this began a major issue in the Washington, D.C. area. The community came out in force. Many city council members came out in force and said, wait a minute, you can't move in here and not understand the relevance of this music and how this manifests itself in the culture and the psyche of this particular community, right? The go-go music came out of Southeast Washington, D.C. They've been playing it for 30 years. And so there's a way in which we have to help folk learn how to show up as being students and not always demanding what it is that they want, because it's disturbing them, because they paid $1 million for these apartments around the corner without first getting to know the community, without getting to know the culture, without getting to know the people that were there. That is part of the work that we have to do as church right now. We've got to go get to know one another, be in relationship with one another, not show up in a way that is detrimental, and not show up in a way that is, we have to learn how to be deferential in when we show up with one another at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I entirely answered your question, but I'm trying to get there.
No, but you did get at because I mean, part of what you were getting at with that story was, not just a tale of communities rubbing up against each other, but sort of a reiteration of a John Wayne movie, right? That once the settlers get here, then the logic of American history is that they will be able to name this space
That's right.
forevermore. They will be able to, so as soon as the settlers show up, right, and those are the gentrifiers. And, one thing I want to be clear about is that when I use the word gentrifier, I don't always use it in a negative way, because a couple of times in our journeys throughout the United States, Susan, Kiara, and I have been gentrifiers, right? We've moved into neighborhoods that our paychecks could have allowed us to live someplace else, but we chose to live in this neighborhood. And the entire point is that we wanted to become a part of the community. We didn't think of ourselves as the first wave of people that were going to be sweeping the poor folk out.
That's right. That's right.
But let me ask you, and this will be the last question before we open it up for questions from the audience. What is the responsibility, do you think, for people of goodwill and faith leading up to the election, but then on the other side of the election?
Well, actually, it's kind of funny, because that's probably where I spend most of my energy right now, thinking about the other side of the election and how do we respond to the chaos that's about to ensue. I think the responsibility for folk right now is to encourage people to get out and exercise their civic right and responsibility of voting. And Dr. Ray, I want to go back to something you said. Must have been about 2015, maybe even before that. You had just come to Chicago, and I called you and said, "Hey, doing this workshop today, and I need help because one of our speakers dropped out. Could you jump in for me?" And you were absolutely magnificent. We had African American religious leaders from around the country that gathered in Chicago, and you said something that was incredibly profound that day. That and I'm paraphrasing, so if I misquote you, feel free to correct me on this. But basically, you said that for folks who are believers, and at least this is from the Christian context, and I realize we have multiple contexts here, that to not vote is a sin. Because basically voting is one of the tools that we have at our disposal to be able to work on bringing God's vision of the world into being. And so, that is something that stuck with me all these years. And I think that that's very true. If we believe in an inclusive and gracious and wonderful God that desires for all humanity to be able to thrive, then one of the things that we have to do is tell our family, our friends, our neighbors, and in many ways be evangelists to that good news, and then share that with them in a way that compels them to go out and vote in that direction. You don't just have to tell them who to vote for, but you can compel them to vote in a direction towards building a world, building a community, picking political leaders that are going to build that sense of beloved community, that world that God ultimately has been driving humanity to since the very beginning of creation that we have just never quite arrived at. So I think that that's really part of what we're doing. The second piece of it is that I think we also have to encourage people to get engaged in the work, right? That it's not just voting, it's actually speaking to political leaders, business leaders, telling them what your expectations are, what you want from them in the world, how you think they need to show up, instead of allowing ourselves, and sometimes what I often feel like, to be victimized by the political elite or the business elite, but actually making demands of them at the same time, which I think we have every right to be able to make demands of them and what we need. And then finally, I would just say post-election, I think we will be the no towards evil that will exist and try to perpetuate itself in this moment in time. And in many ways, I think we are called, and I'll say this from my Christian perspective, that we're going to be called to become exorcists in this moment, to really chase out the evil that exists in our society, to be able to speak it and name it very clearly, with no ambiguity about the evil that we see manifesting, and that we should be thinking seriously about how we are going to support those folks that will take to the streets. So, for example, there are many congregations that have been sanctuary congregations during the immigrant crisis. How can we become sanctuary congregations that are supporting protesters and others that are in the street right now, that are speaking about building beloved community and potentially facing repercussions from the state? Can we house folk? Can we hide folk? Can we maintain folk? Are we prepared to be the prophetic communities of faith that will call for America to live not only to its better self, but to a new self that is something that we have never quite seen before? Can we allow ourselves to dream big right now, even if it is something that we have not fully experienced? But can we imagine dreaming big and put out those dreams and invite people to live into that with us in terms of being architects of a new America, architects of our new town, our new city, our new state, or a new world? Can we imagine a world where we can breathe clean air, drink clean water, and be able to move us into a better world? So I think that those are some of the things that we have to do. And I think one of the things that we say in Faith in Action is that the first revolution is internal. You can't do an external revolution until you have an internal revolution. And I think for some of us, we will have to have an internal revolution. We will have to have a crisis moment, but we will have to ask ourselves the hard question: is it more important for me to be comfortable, or is it more important for me to speak the truth about our faith and our God as we understand it, and potentially put ourselves at risk? Some of us will have to put our bodies on the line. Some of us will have to put our jobs on the line. But many of us will be fighting for that which is just and true, which is a world where all of our children are able to thrive and live their full best lives.
Well, Bishop, thank you. Thank you for that. And the title of that talk, you recall, was Voting is a Salvific Activity.
Yes, that's it right there. Yes, it was powerful. And you slayed us all. If I could be Pentecostal for a minute, we were all slain in the spirit in that moment. So it was powerful. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So thank you. So what I want to do now is I'm going to turn to questions that you all might have. And Lisa, could I ask you to